Eddie, to another episode of SaaS Stories. Today, I'm super excited to be joined by Eddie Lin from NexusEdge, all the way from Los Angeles, although he's wearing a very lovely Australia shirt today. So I'm very pleased with that. Welcome, Eddie.
Yes, thanks for having me. Appreciate it. Always love going to Australia as well. Make it there a couple times a year.
Absolutely. Well, best time to come is maybe in a couple of months when we finally get our lovely summer. Winter has been quite horrible, but anyways, we'll move on from that.
Beautiful.
Tell me about your experience in the SaaS space and really what inspired you to start NexusEdge, as well as maybe a little brief overview of what is NexusEdge.
Yeah, I think my career journey itself provides a lot of insight into what we do and how we do it and why we do it. And so I studied electrical engineering in uni, and I'm not sure I was the greatest fan of it. So I was trying to figure out what the next step was for career-wise. So my first jobs out of college were at UBS Investment Bank and Goldman Sachs, and that was in New York. So I moved over there. And then I went on to move to LA. So went to business school out here. And then what happened was trying to look for other industries, different industries to work in. I worked at Adobe in San Jose, which is near San Francisco. And when I graduated, I thought it'd be more fun to be a contestant on the reality show Fear Factor than, do another job, I suppose, right of graduation. I don't know if you guys have that show. It's where you
We
like eat.
do. Yes.
Oh, you do? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yes, so that involved eating bees for me. And after that, I went to Live Nation Ticketmaster doing concerts for a while. And then after a while, it's about, I felt like what happens a lot, I think, in the education system in general is that not a lot of what you learn in school has prepared, from our experiences, has prepared students for the actual workforce. And there's this fundamental disconnect. And from what I've seen, it's been going on for a very long time. So there seemed to be systemic issues within education. It didn't really impact me so much, but I think it impacts a lot of the world a good bit. So it became, how do you solve this problem? And we had to tackle it from a lot of different angles. But that's the big reason why we started it the way we did. And I can kind of go into the details product-wise or anything like that. But before I delve too deep in anything, I was curious if that was anything I missed in terms of background on your original question.
No, I think the only thing I was thinking is, as you were telling that story, is that, school might not necessarily prepare you for the workforce, but it definitely doesn't prepare you for entrepreneurship. So I guess I'm just wondering what inspired you to go, do you know what, I can do this better. I'm going to take this on and start my own thing.
Well, a lot of my friends that I worked with in New York actually started their own thing. That's interesting because when you see your peers doing something, it's very different than reading about something on the news. So you're like, well, if my friends are doing these things, starting their own companies and doing stuff, why not do it yourself, right? So that was one thing that I think was a big instigator. I think other things too is, I've worked in a lot of different careers, and I think that has been, like I felt like I've done that already. So I felt like a natural next step is doing something that is very meaningful to me that I have a lot of autonomy over. I think that was part of it too. So it was a combination of autonomy, doing something that was meaningful to me personally, and seeing my peers do the same.
Yeah, if they can do it, I can do it type mentality. I think that definitely helps. So when scaling NexusEdge, what were the biggest challenges you faced in the early days?
Well, I think the education system in general is very difficult to scale. I mean, scaling anything is difficult, but I think that when it comes to, the education system, it's been a certain way for a very long time. The way funding structures typically work in education all over the world is the end user isn't necessarily the person making the financial decisions, which is kind of an odd thing, right? So if you build a SaaS product, as is the nature of this podcast, those decision makers in the education system are typically made by folks, then this is nothing wrong, nothing against them. It's just people who are they're not really in the classroom day to day, right? So the product that we have is for teachers using day to day and impact students very directly. So it becomes very interesting in bridging that gap, even within the same school, is people who don't necessarily spend as much time in the classroom because of the nature of their role, versus, having to optimize the product for the nature of very specific requirements for our end users, which in this case is mostly teachers and a little bit of students as well.
Yeah, that's very interesting, actually. I think some industries could relate to that challenge where the end user is not necessarily the buyer. And I actually had a very interesting conversation recently with Martin Garvey from Gong, who's a sales leader. And he was saying, in order to sell SaaS, you actually need 4 people in addition to the one person that you're talking to, in the meeting where the deal actually happens. So I guess with EdTech, what's been your experience? Who are those maybe 4 people that would be the final decision makers of the product, if not the teachers? Who are they?
Yeah, it's interesting is it varies by the organization. Which interesting is people they have different titles, even though they're functionally kind of doing the same thing. In some like TAFEs in the US, we call them community colleges here, there's a lot of dedicated people towards workforce initiatives or education. They're dedicated towards those types of roles. Those types of folks generally are tied to for the product that we do. That is kind of who the decision makers generally fall under. Any sort of folks that are senior within the organizations are always helpful, but sometimes they aren't always the final decision maker. So it really does vary based on the organization, the country, the market. But I would say if I were to segment it out, it would be more senior levels of people within the education system. At the same time, those with slightly more responsibilities on the career outcomes of the students there, regardless of what the role is called.
Yeah, yeah. Interesting. It always varies, and it's quite a big challenge for the marketers, for example, who have to map out, who are the stakeholders of the accounts that we want to target and things like that. So I always love asking those questions. There's always lots to learn there. Speaking of learning, what lessons did you learn from your initial product launch? I know that always has its challenges. So I'm really curious to find out what your story is there and how that shaped your subsequent strategies.
Yes, endless pivoting. How about that? There's endless pivoting for so many reasons, but I think in this space, one of the biggest lessons actually that helped me was becoming a faculty member. I think that was interesting from a product perspective. Is I feel a lot of ed tech founders, they come at a perspective from what their experience was working in another industry, but I think it's very different when you're an actual educator, and I think it makes a lot of sense. And when people talk about product wise, is if you are your end user, I think you get a lot of insights from asking your peers and yourself from just using the platform that is very, very helpful that you wouldn't normally see. So I think when I became an adjunct faculty at 2 TAFEs out here in California, they asked me if I wanted to teach. I had never taught anything before. I was like, "Are you sure this is okay?" They're like, "You're good." So it was good. It was a great experience. A lot of cool things happened with the students, but at the same time, it provided a lot of insights. Now, if we were to really dig in specifically, the education system is very unique because to gain adoption, probably the most direct way to reach a large number of students is the learning management system. That essentially serves as your phone. If we were thinking about, how the analogy in other industries would be, bunch of apps connect to something that we're all connected to is the phone, but the phone doesn't do a ton without the apps. It's not transformative per se. So in the classroom sense, it is the learning management system. And we've built one of our best distribution channels is through attaching through the learning management system. So what is unique about the way we did that is I think the problems that we're solving around career and training students for those careers typically doesn't happen through the learning management system as a distribution channel. So we actually took a very unique approach to do that. It's very challenging to do that. I think the experience that gave me the insights to where I have great conviction that that is the only way to do that is from being an instructor. So that is one of the things we pivoted to that I think was the most consequential, but at the same time, that also wouldn't have happened had I not served as our own end user.
Yeah. And what are those biggest kind of questions that you get from students around careers? I mean, I can imagine a lot of them graduate and they just don't know what they're doing and where they're going next, and really probably asking you, how do we figure this out? So what would you say to that?
So it's interesting is we still work with students very closely to this day because they're another key stakeholder for what we do. So we work with a lot of interns as well at all different points in their lives, from high school to uni to TAFE students as well. You know, the questions are basically what you just said. They've remained the same for decades now. Is
Yeah.
people are not sure what they want to do. They're not sure how to get there. I think that is the result of a couple things. Is you know, the school system isn't necessarily optimized to do career education and also or like not in the sense of exploration so much as a core part of instruction. So it's hard for them to, they have to go outside of their day-to-day to even find that. The
Mm.
resources on that can be tricky as well. So not only are you making something ancillary to what your day-to-day classroom experience is, the resources themselves aren't really as plentiful or as precise as we would like. So I suppose, which is probably not the greatest of advice, but I feel like most people do this and there's not that many other ways to do it than experience it, is take your best possible guess. I mean, that there's nothing quite like learning something about it unless you do it. So I think you do as much research and interviews or whatever as you can, but at the end of the day, you're not going to know what that industry is like unless you actually do it.
Yeah.
And if you make a mistake, go back to business school, and then you can reset a lot of things. So going back to school is a kind of interesting reset switch I've seen a lot of people do. And so if your first guess isn't quite the right industry or role or something, there are ways to fix it. It does become harder as time progresses, but I still think at the ultimate, in the end of the day, it's going to be your best possible guess.
Yeah. No, I love that as advice. I think, yeah, just keep trying things until you land on something that you really love, passionate about, and can do well, I think. And when I guess you have the benefit and advantage of young age at that time to really explore and discover, which is much better advice than what I was given back in the day. I think we were just sent some personality quizzes and then we just got, 10 different jobs that we would be good at, none of which were very helpful.
Oh, they still do that, by the way. So
Oh,
a
no.
lot has evolved in a long time, because that's what I was told just a few weeks ago, actually. And that's what I experienced actually when I was also graduating college and high school. So yeah, not much has changed, and I think
Not much
that's
has
okay.
changed.
But it needs to change at the same time for the reasons I think we also recognize.
Yeah. Absolutely. Um, Marketing tactics in scaling NexusEdge. I always selfishly ask this question. I myself am in marketing, so I always love learning from people, what marketing strategies or tactics or channels, especially in the world of ed tech, have really helped you grow.
Yeah, so I think I'd like to take some lessons away from my prior corporate history, because I think that is relatable as well as helpful towards the end story. So when I was at Adobe, I was in marketing for their B2B products, actually, which is unique because most people know them for their consumer products like Photoshop or something. So really being able to understand how to segment audiences and
Mm.
helping that audience segmentation make the B2B sales team more efficient, I think is an important thing. That way you spend less time knocking on the wrong doors and spending more time knocking on the right doors. And I think when it came to entertainment at Live Nation and Ticketmaster, I was on that B2B side as well. And a lot of that is just very much hustle. Going to places, meeting strangers, calling people, knocking on doors, the equivalent of that in this era. And I think that is both of those organizations from the corporate sense had a lot of takeaways here. So one of the big things I always tell students is, be like, enjoy talking to strangers. If you genuinely like go to the right, so this is like the Adobe part where I segment audiences, but instead of a spreadsheet, it's me going to events where like-minded people that I could work with hang out. And a lot of the times that is the conference, and is their intent to talk to people. Otherwise, they wouldn't have flown halfway across the world to go to these conferences. So, but human nature, they're inherently just risk averse, or people not wanting to talk to strangers is kind of awkward for most people, but they do want to talk to you, otherwise they wouldn't be there. So that's actually kind of what networking to me is talking to as many strangers as possible. And I think that has, making as many friends as possible too. I had a lot of really fun, genuine friendships from these things. And I think that's part of what this is all about too, is that you enjoy what you do and you meet other people that are enjoying as well. And you like the people that you work with and you have fun hanging out with them as well. So I think all of it, there's a lot of positive synergies all around. But I think one of the big things is for anything B2B, just meeting as many strangers as possible, seeing if you can help solve their problems, and having a really fun time doing it.
That's so true. Like really just, the power of people, getting to know them, growing that connection, and then really honing in on, okay, how can I help them with the challenges that they're having? I think what's really unfortunate is that it wouldn't come naturally. I mean, if you think about the way kids are raised, there's just so much that goes in from their parents and even schools around stranger danger and, don't talk to strangers. And then they reach a certain age and it's like, go talk to strangers.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, they've internalized growing up when they're most impressionable that talking to strangers is dangerous. Yet when
Mm.
there comes a point in life when they're doing some sort of B2B type framework where talking to strangers is critical. So you're making essentially an unnatural transition. And I guess one of the most impactful classes, who'd have thought I got it from school, is during business school, I took a film class, actually, oddly enough. It was an elective where we had to crash a party and write a paper about it. I
That
thought
is
that
the
was
coolest assignment I've ever heard.
it was really interesting. I crashed Steve Wynn's wedding after party, if you're familiar with him, like the Wynn hotels and stuff like that. He was getting married that weekend, and he had a after party at one of those clubs and at Encore and stuff like that. So I ended up doing selfies with the people I met at that, and including that as part of my paper. That has led to a lot of the opportunities that we have in this day. So just having fun, going to those things, and it's led to some really, really interesting stuff. So I think part of it was overcoming the stranger danger, I suppose,
Hmm.
is talking is a class, but it doesn't have to be a class. But it was an exercise where I had to crash a party and write a paper about it. And I think that is going to be something that you can do, even if you're not in school, you can do it anytime. And I think that type of repetition helps people get comfortable overcoming stranger danger and things that we are normally ingrained in as we grow up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of kind of unlearning and relearning that needs to be done in that case. And you're right. It's been in my experience as well, working almost 20 years in marketing. I think it's all about the connections that you make, the networks, the relationships. A lot of it is sales activation. So I'm curious if you've found, maybe things like brand have played a big role in scaling as well. I recently was looking at some research from LinkedIn and the B2B Marketing Institute, and they were showing little graphs of growth for a lot of businesses. So sales activation definitely helps over time, but brand, which is something that's really difficult to get customers from in the early days, actually ended up overtaking sales activation after, the first 4 to 5 years in business. So I'm curious to see if you've seen something like that as well.
Yeah, I think in your space is interesting because as long as you build a larger presence in your specific marketing segment, I think that is actually building a brand. I think people, when they think of brand, they necessarily think of a brand that they'll see on their day to day, where it doesn't have to be a consumer brand you're as familiar with. So another example is, you see the words like Snowflake, it's a gigantic B2B company, yet when you ask the general populace, they have no idea. They think that's something that happens in the winter when it's cold and there's precipitation outside, right? So for me, branding, I think in B2B is unique. I think it's making sure that there's a general awareness of who you are within your space, even very as much as precisely as possible. I felt like even a general familiarity has been helpful in those sales activations. I think that another part of a lot of this is really just social proof has been really important too, because when people look for your information online or there's other organizations that people are familiar with as a consumer brand, that they either point to, have done stuff with you that is helpful, I think, from a branding perspective as well. So I think branding is more narrow. It is effective, but more narrow. It can be more narrow and less, doesn't have to be as obvious as I think is what a typical consumer would imagine from a product perspective.
Yeah, I think social proof is a really good point, actually, because an interesting quote I've heard around brand is not who you think you are, brand is who your customers think you are, and they essentially define who the brand is.
Right.
Now you have some pretty major clients like Google and Citi. I'd love to know, how did you go about having just getting in the door with these kind of big enterprise level clients? Because I think for many SaaS companies, it's kind of it they start off maybe quite general with their target audience. They're hoping to land enterprise clients. It doesn't always work that way. I'd love to know maybe strategies for talking to some of these big guys.
Yeah, it actually goes back to what we talked about before, is talking to strangers. Isn't that interesting? Is that I think people, that goes back to branding again too, is I think people are scared by brands, actually. That's what's interesting is
I
that,
think so too.
yeah, so brands almost have like a negative effect in founders in the SaaS space. Is what people don't realize at the end of the day, people are just people, and everybody is just there to get to know and hang out with each other. So, talking to strangers and people are people, and you're helping them solve their problems to some degree, then that's when you can work together and help each other. I think as long as you find ways to solve each other's problems, then there is that opportunity there and not worrying about a particular brand. So then the question becomes, how do you solve a problem that a large resourceful organization hasn't solved themselves? And I think that's when you really focus on a particular market that is also has to be a large market, obviously, otherwise it wouldn't be relevant to them. So focus on a large market that's pretty specialized, but also do it really well. And it's going to be some element of uncertainty as well, which is probably why they still value that process and that market, but aren't really willing to take that type of risk because it doesn't make sense when they have so many other priorities. But as a founder, you can specialize in that particular area. You are a bit more risk tolerant by nature. And so I think by doing that and talking to the right strangers at those organizations and knowing that you can solve their problems because you've done that and using a lot of creativity along the way, maybe if you make a few slight pivots, you can solve their problems. And those pivots can be reused in other places as well. That's how you can really help, in my opinion, work with basically any brand, because you're solving a problem with even those who are most resources value but have trouble solving because of a high degree of specialization.
I love that advice. I think you're so right. Like people would look at, companies like Google and Citi and go, always kind of get scared and, how are we going to approach these guys? But you're right. At the end of the day, it's just people within those organizations and they're just like anybody else. So really just finding, how can we connect with the people within these companies, get to know them, find that, really specific pain point that they're experiencing that we can really help with. That's fantastic.
Thanks. I think part of that mentality has also come from having worked at organizations like that in the past. I think that other people would have gotten hung up on some of the companies I worked at before, and that when you're there, you realize that also people are just people and we do lots of dumb things and have fun together. So if we're spending all this time just to go see a hot dog eating contest, like how big of a brand is it if that's all the people are doing all day, your friends are doing all day with you? So I think once you see that kind of stuff, you don't worry about a brand being a barrier so much.
Yeah, no, that's a really good learning. Thank you for that. Um, Future trends in EdTech. Now, obviously, AI has been thrown around as a word a lot. That's probably going to have a massive impact on a lot of industries. What are some future trends that you see specifically in this industry?
Yeah, what's interesting is I feel like in any sort of new technology theme or process that these things get overhyped to some degree, but AI is real, don't get me wrong. But let's scroll back the sands of time for a second. When apps first came out, that was very transformative. There's an app for that became a thing. So people built a lot of nonsense apps too, despite the ones that we are central to our lives to this day. So a lot of noise, a little bit on the nonsense app side for a while. Then there was the sharing economy for a while too, where there was like an Uber for this and an Airbnb for that. A lot of useless things from there too. And I guess most recently, there's been all this crypto stuff where I guess from my training, where if a currency is not tied to something that has intrinsic value, it is not currency, it's speculative and bad things happen. So there is a lot of noise for anything that gets a lot of hype in the venture space per se. AI obviously has a lot more legs to it as real practical applications as well. Given that, I'd like to just go into the edtech space as you had asked, and I think there are a lot bigger problems in the edtech space than they're not necessarily that can be solved, that need to be solved outside AI. Actually, some of the core systemic issues you see in education are the ones you see over and over again is I go to school, I'm in a whole ton of debt, can't get a job. Like that is probably one of the biggest ones because that questions the value of your degree. You're in a ton of debt. People start wondering that it goes to school closures because people don't see the value in it. There's like, tons of money spent on textbooks that don't necessarily need to be. There's a lot of things like that happen, and that can be solved, shouldn't be solved necessarily through AI. Actually, these are processes that need to be broken. So actually, I think the core issue, the systemic issues within education for us is changing classroom instruction at scale, making sure what students learning in class reflects what employer needs are. And this checks off a lot of people's boxes because the employers are getting candidates that already know what they need to do instead of having to train them for like 6 months when they start.
Yeah.
Risk for them. They're willing to hire more. So school becomes more valuable. Their degrees become more valuable. So there's a lot of systemic problem. Like the systemic problem is changing classroom instruction at scale. And all those things you hear about, they're also major topics to me are ancillary, actually. So, and that has nothing to do with AI. So although I think people may start building AI, they have started building AI applications that have some value across the board. I think one of the biggest issues within EdTech actually is not related to AI. Although certainly we're adding things ourselves to support a lot of manual functions that need to be automated. But I think for EdTech, I think we shouldn't lose focus on what I think the core issue that I have great conviction is the problem within the education system that needs to be solved.
No, that's a really good take on it. I think, when people talk about trends and future trends, they're kind of just thinking, oh, what new and cool tech's going to be invented? But you're right, there's so many problems within the systems of many industries. And I think maybe just looking to those and how do we fix them is the right way to go. I think it's very sad. I have heard a lot of stories with, students graduating 100 grand in debt and they can't find a job straight out of university. So it's it's definitely a problem that needs fixing.
Yeah, and AI is not going to solve that necessarily. Like maybe a really cool robot that tutors you, but what is the point of going to school if there's a bot? Like you can see how people would stuff in some form of AI application to address that problem you just mentioned, but at the core of it is something much bigger. It's a process issue.
Yeah, for sure. My last question for you, as a SaaS founder, what has been your most significant learning experience and what advice would you give to other people looking to become a SaaS founder?
So I think there's two things. One is actually not directly tied to SaaS. I think one of them is your team. I've had to figure that one out a few times. And so part of that is making sure, I guess this is any tech founder really. I think the optimal team, I think, is 3 founders who each one are very highly specialized in these three functions. One of them is very good like hustler, stranger talking person, that person. Another one would be a really great product manager. Another one is someone who's an outstanding software engineer. So as a SaaS founder or even tech founder of any means, those are the 3 roles I think are key core functions that I think set the foundation for a lot of things. So I'll say that. And I think later on, I think something that's important is trying to make sure that we kind of touched on this earlier too, is that if your core day-to-day user isn't necessarily the person who's making the decisions on what product gets used in this situation, how do we bring everybody closer together to help them understand that value is being delivered? So I think that's the unique part of SaaS, is that for any sort of industry, like you said, there was others that you mentioned, that's the tricky part about it too, is the people making financial decisions aren't necessarily the user, and that happens a lot in SaaS. So I think that is a tricky thing, that overcoming it changes based on the industry that you're in.
Yeah, sure. Eddie, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate your insights. I've certainly learned a lot, and I'm sure the audience has gotten some really wonderful strategies and insights into how they can approach their businesses as well. Really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks for having me, and I hope that was helpful in the line. So anybody, always feel free to reach out to me anytime. I'm always messaging on any apps and talking to strangers. So happy to chat with anyone.
Fantastic. Maybe they can get a lesson on talking to strangers.
It is, yeah, anybody can do it. That's the part that's nice about it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much.
All right, anytime. All right, have a good week.